19 vehicles, the best heavy recovery company in the Pacific Northwest. A structural engineer flown in from Denver on 4 hours' notice. 6 full hours of trying chains pulled to their breaking point, cranes swinging loads they were never designed to carry, industrial winches screaming against resistance until their motors burned and their cables frayed. Everything they had, every tool, every technique, every machine built for exactly this kind of problem. Not 1 inch of movement. The experts had already begun writing their reports. The cargo sitting on that locked train was worth $23 million, and the conclusion was the same from every professional standing on that mountain. Impossible to move. Not today. Not with anything they had brought. Then a quiet old man in a worn canvas jacket stepped forward from the tree line, where he had been standing for hours watching in silence while everyone else failed. He wore no hard hat. He carried no clipboard. He had no credentials that anyone on that mountain could see. And what he said next made every single person there stop cold. But that moment had not arrived yet. The call came in at 6:14 on a Tuesday morning, and by the time the first crew reached mile marker 47 on the old Rocky Pass line, the sun was just beginning to crawl over the eastern ridge, throwing long shadows across the tracks and painting the mountainside in pale gold light that made everything look calm and quiet and completely at odds with the crisis waiting below. What they found stopped them where they stood. Locomotive 983, a Union Pacific freight hauler stretching nearly 300 feet from engine to last car, sat dead on the tracks, not derailed, not flipped on its side, not tangled in debris or blocked by a landslide or any of the dozen scenarios the dispatch team had been preparing for on the drive up. She was simply stopped, immovable. 4,000 tons of steel and cargo sitting on 2 rails in the mountains of the Pacific Northwest, as if she had decided somewhere in the night that she was not going anywhere and nothing in the world was going to change her mind. The train had been carrying industrial steel beams, commercial generators, rated for city power grids, and 40 sealed freight containers bound for a major construction project in Portland. The kind of project where every day of delay costs more than most people earn in a year. Every single hour that Locomotive 983 sat on those tracks, the shipping company was hemorrhaging close to $20,000. And the hours were already adding up. Barrett Aldridge stood at the front of the scene with a paper cup of coffee going cold in his hand and a knot forming somewhere behind his sternum that he had not felt in 20 years of handling rail emergencies. He was a trim man, 48 years old, the kind of man who kept his shirts pressed even on overnight calls, and who had built his entire career on the principle that panic was a luxury he could not afford. 20 years of derailments, cargo spills, equipment failures, and political crises that came with managing freight operations across 3 states. He had handled all of it without ever once raising his voice above a conversational tone. But this morning, standing in the mountain air with the smell of diesel and cold iron around him, Aldridge felt something he had not felt in a very long time. The tight, specific dread of a man who understands that the situation in front of him might be bigger than anything he knows how to fix. It was not just the train. That morning, before the emergency call had pulled him out of bed, Aldridge had opened an email from the Portland Regional Office. He had made the final shortlist for the position of Regional Director of Operations, a job he had applied for 3 years running and been passed over for twice. The email was brief and corporate and carefully worded, but the meaning was clear. The final decision would be based on demonstrated performance in real-world crisis management during the current quarter. He was standing inside the test right now. $23 million of stuck cargo, a construction project bleeding money by the hour, and every eye in the company watching how he handled it. Aldrich folded that thought carefully and pushed it down below his ribs, where it could ache without interfering with his ability to think. He had learned that trick a long time ago. The on-site mechanic delivered the initial assessment. Ira Overby was young, early 30s, with a face that still looked like it belonged in a college classroom, but hands that told a different story. Scarred, calloused, stained with grease that never quite washed out, no matter how hard you scrubbed. The hands of someone who had been taking machines apart since he was old enough to hold a wrench. Ira wiped his forearms with a red shop rag and spoke with the flat certainty of a man reporting facts he wished were different. Drive axle locked up. Sees clean through. She is not going anywhere under her own power. We are going to need heavy recovery equipment just to get her rolling. Aldridge nodded slowly and reached for his phone. Then he paused and looked at Ira for a moment longer than necessary. Something about the last name. Overby, you any relation to the old man who lives out at the end of Route 9? It was a casual question. The kind of thing you ask to fill a silence while you are scrolling through your contacts. But the reaction it produced was not casual at all. Ira's shoulders went stiff. Just for half a second, barely noticeable, but Aldridge had spent 2 decades reading people under pressure, and he noticed everything. My grandfather, Ira said. His voice had changed, flatter, guarded. But he retired before I was born. It has nothing to do with this. He said nothing to do with this too quickly. The way people speak when they are building a wall around a subject they do not want anyone to touch. Aldridge filed it away and had made his calls. Within 2 hours, the mountain road leading to the pass was lined with recovery vehicles. Harmon Industrial Towing, the largest commercial tow operation in the Pacific Northwest, arrived first. A convoy of bright yellow, heavy-duty trucks rumbled up the grade in a line that stretched back a quarter-mile, their chrome grills gleaming and their engines growling with the kind of deep, confident power that makes the ground vibrate under your feet. Their lead operator stepped out of the first truck and surveyed the scene the way a general surveys a battlefield he has already decided to win. Cass Mangrum was broad-shouldered and thick-necked, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same material as his truck bumpers. He moved through the world the way certain men do, occupying space as if it were a birthright, speaking in a voice that expected to be the loudest in any room. He had been running heavy recovery operations for 18 years, and he had built Harmon's reputation on one simple promise. We move what cannot be moved. It was printed on the side of every truck in the fleet. Give us 90 minutes, Mangrum told Aldridge, shaking his hand with the grip of a man who wanted you to know he was strong before he wanted you to know anything else about him. We have moved heavier things than this. Then Mangrum turned to the locomotive and saw Ira Overby crouching near the front wheel assembly, examining the contact point between the drive wheels and the railhead. Ira had been there for 20 minutes, quietly studying the way the wheels had settled into the metal, making notes on a grease-stained pad he kept in his back pocket. Hey kid, step out. This area needs people who know what they are doing. Ira stood up slowly. His face went red from the collar up, a flush that started at his neck and climbed to his ears. His jaw tightened. His hand closed around the red shop rag and squeezed it the way you squeeze something when what you really want to squeeze is a throat. But he did not say a word. He just stepped, edged, and walked back to the perimeter without looking at anyone. Aldridge watched the exchange and registered 2 things. First, Mangrum did not just have confidence. He had a method, and that method was built on eliminating every voice in the room that was not his own. Second, Ira Overby, the man who had correctly diagnosed the problem before anyone else on the mountain had even finished their first cup of coffee, had just been dismissed like a child who had wandered into an adults-only conversation. Aldridge said nothing. He was not yet sure which of those observations would matter, but he was beginning to suspect that at least one of them would. 90 minutes came and went, then 2 hours, then 3. The chains Harmon's crew rigged between their trucks and the locomotive went taut with a sound like a guitar string being tuned past its limit, and then they snapped. Broken chain links flew across the gravel like shrapnel, and one of them embedded itself in the side panel of a Harmon truck hard enough to leave a dent the size of a fist. The hydraulic winches groaned under loads they had never been designed to sustain, and their motors overheated, and their cables began to fray strand by strand until the operators had to shut them down before they came apart entirely. And then came the moment that changed the mathematics of the entire operation. One of Harmon's specialized tow rigs, a custom-built machine, with reinforced steel tow bars rated for over 800,000 pounds of pulling force locked onto the front coupling of Locomotive 983 and pulled. The engine roared, the tires bit into the gravel, the tow bar, a piece of hardened steel as thick as a man's thigh, and designed to withstand forces that would tear a building off its foundation, bent first with a slow, sickening creak, and then cracked with a sound that echoed off the mountain walls like a rifle shot. 800,000 pounds of rated capacity, and Locomotive 983 had not moved a single inch. Mangrum stood looking at the broken tow bar for 10 seconds without speaking. It was the longest anyone had ever seen him go without filling a silence. Then he turned and walked back to his truck and got on the radio to order more equipment with the tight, controlled movements of a man who was furious but not yet willing to admit why. The mountain air smelled like burnt rubber and hot metal. Harmon brought in a second convoy, then a third. Industrial cranes were requested from a facility 40 miles south. 2 heavy lift rigs were trucked in on flatbed trailers, their operators professional and confident, and certain that their machines would succeed where the others had failed. None of it worked. By midday, there were 19 recovery vehicles staged along the mountain road, their engines idling, their operators standing in small groups with their arms crossed, and not one of them had moved Locomotive 983 a single foot from where she had stopped in the night. That was when the helicopter from Denver brought Dr. Hazel Fisk. She arrived with no entourage and no fanfare, a woman in her early 50s with short gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses and the deliberate, unhurried movements of someone who has spent her career in rooms where precision matters more than speed. She was one of the foremost structural engineers in the country, specializing in heavy rail recovery, and she had been called because the situation had officially exceeded every standard protocol in the company's emergency response manual. Fisk walked the full length of Locomotive 983 twice without saying a word. She crouched at 6 different points along the track but impressed her fingers into the gravel and the soil beneath it. She took measurements with instruments she pulled from a leather case. She ran calculations on a tablet, entering figures with the focused silence of someone performing surgery. And then she stood up, brushed the dirt from her knees, and delivered her conclusion to Aldridge with the flat certainty of someone reading a weather report. The problem is the ground. She pointed to the soft embankment on the east side of the track where the soil had turned dark and wet. The rain 2 days ago saturated the soil beneath the ballast. Combined with the seized drive axle and the distribution of weight across 32 cars, the train has essentially settled into a locked condition. The wheels have micro embedded into the railhead under compression. Every time you apply pulling force, you increase the binding pressure between the wheel surface and the rail. The friction coefficient rises with each attempt. She paused and looked at the line of yellow trucks stretching back down the mountain road. You are making it worse every time you tread. The silence that followed her words was not the ordinary quiet of people thinking. It was the heavy, airless silence of hope leaving a room. "So what do you suggest?" Aldridge asked. Fisk looked at her tablet. Honestly, we may need to consider partial unloading of the rear cars. That would require a crane operation on the side of a mountain with inadequate access roads. We are looking at 3 to 5 days minimum, assuming we can get the right equipment up here. The cargo damage risk alone could exceed $2 million. 3 to 5 days, $2 million in potential damage, and $20,000 still bleeding out every hour. The crew stood in small groups, speaking in low voices. The energy that had driven the morning's effort, the confidence, the urgency, the belief that the next attempt would be the one that worked, all of it had drained away and left behind something flat and gray and tired. Even Mangrum, who had arrived that morning as if failure were a word that existed only in other people's vocabularies, was leaning against one of his trucks, with his arms crossed and his jaw set, staring at the locomotive with the expression of a man who had just been beaten by something he could not even argue with. That was when Aldridge noticed the old man. He had been there for a while, actually, standing about 30 yards back from the main activity, just beyond the orange safety cones near the tree line where the gravel shoulder gave way to wild grass and Douglas fir. He was not wearing a hard hat or a safety vest. He was not holding a clipboard or a radio or a phone. He was just standing there, hands in the pockets of a worn canvas work jacket that looked like it had been washed 100 times and patched at least twice watching. He looked to be somewhere in his late 70s, maybe older, short and lean, with the kind of thinness that comes not from frailty, but from a lifetime of physical work that burned everything unnecessary away. His face was deeply lined, weathered in the way that wood weathers when it has spent decades in sun and wind and rain, the kind of face that looks like it was carved rather than grown. And his eyes, pale gray, moved slowly and carefully across the scene with an attention that was different from everyone else's. Not curiosity, not the wide-eyed fascination of a bystander watching something dramatic unfold. Something quieter, the focused, patient attention of someone who has seen something like this before and is thinking. Ira Overby saw him, and the change in Ira's body was immediate and unmistakable. He turned away fast, deliberately, the way you turn away from someone you do not want to be seen recognizing. One of the Harmon crew members noticed. "You know that old guy." "No," Ira said, and the lie was as obvious as a grease stain on a white shirt. Aldridge almost turned away himself. He had engineers and specialists in a logistics crisis burning through $20,000 every 60 minutes and a career hanging on the outcome. He did not have time for a local curiosity seeker who had wandered up to watch the commotion. But something made him stop. Maybe it was the way the old man was looking at the train. Not at the spectacle of it, not at the line of yellow trucks or the cranes or the crews milling around with their hands in their pockets. He was looking at the wheels, at the point where the iron met the rail, at the place where the problem lived, and he was looking at it the way an experienced man looks at something he has already understood. Aldridge walked over. "Sir, this is an active recovery zone. I am going to have to ask you to step back behind the perimeter." The old man did not move right away. He kept his eyes on the train for another long moment, studying something at the front wheel assembly with an expression that Aldridge could not read, and then he turned slowly and looked at Aldridge directly. His gaze was steady and unhurried, the kind of gaze that does not need to assert itself because it has nothing to prove. "You have got 19 vehicles out here," the old man said. His voice was quiet, not weak quiet, not old man quiet. The kind of quiet that comes from a lifetime of never needing to raise it because people who mattered were already listening. All of them pulling, none of them thinking. He paused. The mountain wind moved through the trees behind him, and the late morning light caught the worn brass buttons on his jacket. "You are using the wrong kind of force. That train does not need more power behind it." He looked back at Locomotive 983, and his expression was something Aldridge could not name. Not pity, not smugness. Something older and more patient than either. It needs something else entirely. Aldridge frowned. And what would that be? The old man just looked at him for a moment. Steady, patient, like a man who has given this answer before and knows better than to rush it. Then he turned and started walking slowly back toward the road, hands still in his pockets, shoulders straight, boots crunching over the gravel with the unhurried pace of someone who has already said everything that needed to be said and sees no reason to linger while other people catch up. Sir Aldridge called after him. The old man kept walking, and Barrett Aldridge, standing there in the shadow of a stalled 4,000-ton train with 19 failed recovery vehicles behind him, and a structural engineer's verdict of impossible still ringing in the air, had the strange and unsettling feeling that the old man walking away from him was the only person on that entire mountain who actually knew what came next. He almost let him go. He watched the old man straight back, moving away down the gravel road, and told himself it was not worth the time. He had Fisk's report. He had a logistics team on standby in Portland. He had a company president who had already called twice that afternoon and whose voice had gotten quieter each time, which was always worse than when it got louder. He did not need a distraction, but $23 million of cargo was sitting on a locked train in the mountains. Every expert on the scene had just told him the same thing. Nothing they had would work, 3 to 5 days minimum. And the old man, the only person at mile marker 47 who had not said impossible, had said something else instead. He had said wrong. Wrong kind of force. That was different from not enough. That was different from impossible. Aldridge walked after him. "Sir, hold on a moment." The old man stopped at the edge of the gravel road, but did not turn right away. He stood there with his hands still in his pockets, looking out toward the tree line with the expression of a man deciding whether the conversation that was about to happen was worth his time. Then he turned slowly. "You done talking to your engineers?" "For now," Aldridge said. "What did you mean back there, wrong kind of force? What does that mean exactly?" The old man studied him for a moment, and Aldridge had the uncomfortable feeling of being evaluated by someone whose standards he did not fully understand. "It means what I said. Every machine has a nature. You work with that nature, you get results. You fight against it, you crack tow bars and burn out winches." Colter Overby spoke the way he moved slowly and with great economy, as if every word cost him something, and he was not in the habit of spending more than he needed to. He stood at the edge of the gravel road with his hands still in his jacket pockets, looking at Aldridge with the patient expression of a man who has explained things to younger men before and has learned not to expect them to understand right away. "Those rigs are built for straight pull," he said, nodding once toward the line of yellow trucks. "Clean ground, clean load, clean resistance. That train has settled. It needs rhythm, not force. It needs to be coaxed loose the way you work a stuck drawer, not yanked." Aldridge stared at him. "And you know how to do that." "I know a machine that does." Colter looked back toward the mountain road, past the line of recovery vehicles, past the crew standing idle towards something only he could see. "I have got a 1908 steam traction engine in a barn about 4 miles from here. Been sitting under a canvas for 31 years, but she still runs." The silence that followed lasted 3 full seconds, which does not sound long until you are standing on the side of a mountain with $23 million worth of stuck cargo, and a man who looks like he should be sitting on a porch somewhere just told you that a machine built before the Titanic sailed is the answer to your problem. Cass Mangrum had walked over without anyone noticing. He let out a short laugh, Not cruel exactly, but disbelieving in the way that men laugh when they have been beaten by something and cannot afford to show it, so they redirect the frustration toward whoever is closest. You are serious, a steam engine from 1908. He looked at Aldridge with raised eyebrows. That thing would be lucky to pull a hay wagon. A couple of the nearby crew members exchanged glances. Someone behind Mangrum made a quiet sound that was close enough to a laugh to count as one. Dr. Fisk did not laugh, but she pressed her lips together in a way that said everything words would have. Colter did not react to any of it. He waited, the way a man waits who has been right before and knows that arguing with doubt is a waste of the same energy he is going to need later. "What is your name?" Aldridge asked. "Colter Overby." "Mr. Overby, have you worked with rail recovery before?" "Not recovery, operations." Colter looked at the locomotive. "I ran steam engines on this line for 19 years. Started in 1959, retired in 1978. I know this grade. I know how this track settles after heavy rain. And I know what that kind of wheel lock looks like. I have seen it 4 times before." He paused. "The other 3 times we moved the train." Aldridge caught the gap immediately. The 4th time, Colter was quiet. Not the quiet of hesitation. The quiet of a man deciding how much of a wound to open for a stranger. His jaw moved slightly, the way it does when you clench and unclench teeth around something you have carried for a long time. The 4th time was 1974. We did not get her loose. He said nothing more, but something in the way he said it, something in the way the words dropped and landed heavy and stayed where they fell, told Aldridge there was more behind that sentence than a failed tow job. Something personal, something that had left marks. Aldridge looked at the train. He looked at Fisk, who gave a small, reluctant shrug that carried the full weight of a woman who had no better option to offer and was honest enough to admit it. He looked at Mangrum, who looked away. "You said your engine has been sitting for 31 years, Aldridge said carefully. "How confident are you that she will actually start?" Colter was quiet again, choosing his words the way a carpenter chooses where to place a nail. "She will need preparation, a few hours, maybe 4. I will need a hand or 2. He paused. "But yes, she will start." "Barrett, we have got a full recovery operation staged here," Mangrum said, stepping forward. "We do not need to waste time on a museum piece. Your recovery operation has tried for 6 hours. Colter turned to look at Mangrum directly for the first time. His voice did not rise, did not harden. It stayed exactly where it had been the entire conversation, low and even and steady, and somehow that steadiness was more unsettling than any amount of shouting would have been. "You have broken equipment. You have increased the wheel lock by about 30% based on what I can see from here. And your structural engineer just told you it would take 3 to 5 more days." He looked at Aldridge. "I am asking for 4 hours." Mangrum pulled Aldridge aside. The 2 men stood 10 feet from the group, close enough to see the locomotive but far enough that the crew could not hear them clearly. Mangrum spoke first, his voice low and controlled, and carrying the particular intensity of a man whose professional pride has been wounded and who is looking for someone to blame. "Dalton, you cannot be serious about this. We have a full professional recovery operation staged here with equipment rated for exactly this kind of situation, and you want to hand the job over to some old-timer with a relic. If this gets out, if corporate hears that you authorized an uninsured civilian with an unregistered antique to work on a $23 million asset, we are both finished." Aldridge looked at him. He was tired. His coffee had been cold for 6 hours. His phone had 17 missed calls. His career was sitting on a knife edge between a promotion and a permanent dead end. and he was standing on the side of a mountain listening to a man whose equipment had just failed tell him that trying something different was the real risk. Your professional operation tried for 6 hours, Vernon. You cracked a tow bar rated for 800,000 pounds. The structural engineer says 3 to 5 days. He is asking for 4 hours. Mangram's jaw tightened. He held Aldridge's gaze for a long moment, and in that moment, Aldridge saw something shift behind the man's eyes, a recalculation, a strategic retreat. Then Mangrum turned and walked back to his truck without another word. 4 hours, Aldridge said to Colter. Show me the engine. The barn sat at the end of a dirt lane off Route 9 behind a farmhouse with a sagging porch and a front yard full of old tools arranged with the careful order of someone who valued things the world had long stopped valuing. Wrenches hung by size on a wooden rack mounted to the porch railing. An anvil sat on a stump near the door, its surface polished to a dark mirror by decades of use. A set of iron tongs leaned against the wall beside a coal bucket that had been scrubbed clean enough to eat from. It was not a museum. It was not a monument to the past. It was the yard of a man who still used these things, who still believed they had work left in them, and who maintained them with the same care other men gave to their cars or their golf clubs. A woman appeared at the front door as they pulled up. Willa Overby was mid-70s, small, with white hair pulled back in a simple knot and hands that were red and rough from work. She looked at Colter getting out of the passenger side of Aldridge's truck. She looked at Aldridge. She looked back at Colter. Her, she said. Just one word, but the weight of it filled the entire yard. 31 years of waiting packed into a single syllable. Colter nodded. Willa turned and went back inside without another word. But as Colter passed the doorway, she reached out and placed her hand on his shoulder. Brief, light. The kind of touch that does not ask for acknowledgement because it is not given for the person receiving it to notice. It is given because the person giving it needs to. Aldridge saw it and understood without knowing exactly what he understood, yet that this was not just about pulling a train. He followed Colter through the house toward the back door, and as they passed through the kitchen, Aldridge's eyes caught something on the wall above the stove. A photograph, black and white, slightly yellowed at the edges. A young man, barely 17, stood beside a machine, one hand resting on a massive boiler casing, smiling with the kind of open, unguarded joy that people only have in photographs taken before the worst thing in their life has happened. Below the frame, in careful handwriting that had faded but not disappeared, Pen Overby 1972. Aldridge did not ask. The question formed in his mind, and he let it sit there unanswered the way you leave a door closed when you can feel heat on the other side. Colter unlocked the large wooden barn doors and swung them open wide. Dust fell in slow curtains from the rafters, drifting through the shafts of afternoon light, like something the building had been holding in its lungs for 3 decades and was finally allowed to exhale. He pulled the heavy canvas tarp back slowly. Not the way you uncover a piece of equipment, the way you uncover something that has earned the right to be revealed carefully. The engine was enormous and black, trimmed in faded red and brass that had gone green in patches, but still caught the light. Her boiler was thick and barrel-shaped, bolted with rows of rivets that ran in straight lines from firebox to smokebox. Her drive wheels stood nearly as tall as a man, their iron rims still sharp-edged and true. She sat on her frame with the settled weight of something that had worked hard for a very long time and had rested long enough to have earned it. There was dust on every surface and rust along the lower edge of the firebox door. One of the exhaust pipes had a slight bend that had been repaired by hand decades ago with a weld that held as true as the day it was made. The brass fittings along her side, the pressure gauge housings, the steam valve handles, all of them wore, the specific kind of patina that comes not from neglect, but from use so long and so constant that the metal itself has taken on the shape of the hands that worked it. Colter walked along the side of the engine slowly, his right hand trailing along the boiler casing, not touching it the way you touch something you are inspecting, touching it the way your hand finds the arm of a chair you have sat in 10,000 times. Muscle memory, recognition, a greeting that does not need words because the familiarity is older than language. He stopped at the main steam valve, a large brass handle worn smooth on the grip from decades of palms wrapping around it in the same position, and he placed his fingers around it without turning it. He stood there for a moment, eyes closed, head slightly bowed, listening. Then from somewhere deep inside the boiler, from the cold iron belly of a machine that had not moved or made a sound in 31 years, came a low resonant tone. A tick, then another, then a slow rhythmic knock, metal contracting and expanding at different rates as the ambient temperature that shifted through the open barn doors, the kind of sound that an engineer would explain as simple thermal physics, but that anyone standing in that barn at that moment would have had a hard time calling simple. It sounded like something waking up. Aldridge took a step forward without realizing he had moved. Colter opened his eyes. He looked at the engine with an expression that Aldridge could not decipher, something private, uncertain, and very old. "She remembers," he said softly, and then he got to work. The sound of a second engine came from the dirt road outside. A battered pickup truck, rust-colored and dented in ways that suggested decades of use rather than lack of care, pulled up beside Aldridge's vehicle. A man in his early 60s climbed out. He was tall and angular, with a deeply tanned face and hands that looked like they had been shaking hands with heavy machinery since the Eisenhower administration. He walked into the barn, saw the engine uncovered, saw Colter already moving around her with a wrench in one hand and an oil can in the other, and stopped. "Heard on the radio there is a train stuck at 47, Dillard Benbow said. "I figured you would be opening the barn today." He said it simply, without surprise, the way you state something you have known was coming for a long time. Colter did not look up. He did not need to. The two men began working together with the wordless coordination of people who have shared thousands of hours in the same kind of work and no longer need to discuss who does what. Dillard checked the water level in the boiler system. Colter inspected the firebox lining. Dillard went to the shed behind the property and came back carrying coal in a bucket that might have been the twin of the one on the front porch. Colter began building a fire in the firebox with kindling he had split and stacked in the corner of the barn, dry and ready as if he had always known this day would come. While Colter worked inside the barn, Dillard stepped outside where Aldridge was standing and leaned against the fence rail. He pulled a cigarette from his shirt pocket but did not light it, just held it between his fingers and looked at Aldridge with an expression that was measuring how much to say. "You want to know about 1974, Dillard said. It was not a question. Aldridge waited. Dillard told the story quietly in the flat voice of a man reporting something he has carried for 52 years. Same line, same grade. Train locked on the tracks the same way after heavy rain. Colter had wanted to use the steam engine. The company said no. Modern methods. They brought in equipment and pulled with brute force, and something gave that should not have given. A coupling failed. A car shifted off its center of gravity. Pen Overby Colter's son, 19 years old, working his first season as an apprentice on the line, was caught between the coupling frame and a junction beam when the car shifted. Spinal cord injury, wheelchair for the rest of his life. Penn died 3 years later from complications that the doctors said were related to the injury, but that Colter always believed were related to something else. To the way a young man's spirit breaks when his body is broken at 19, and no one can explain to him why the people in charge chose the method that hurt him instead of the one his father had told him would work. Colter retired in 1978, the year after Penn died. He pulled the canvas over the engine and did not touch it again. Until today, Dillard said. He looked toward the barn where the sound of Colter working on the engine came through the open doors, metal on metal, steady and purposeful. 52 years he has been carrying that around. 52 years knowing he was right and nobody listened. Aldridge stood outside the barn with Dillard's words still settling into him, like cold water soaking into dry ground, and he realized something that made his face feel hot, despite the mountain air. This morning when Colter Overby had stepped out from the tree line, Aldridge's first instinct had been to send him away. Step back behind the perimeter, sir. The polite professional version of the same thing Mangrum had said to Ira. The same thing the company had said to Colter in 1974. Move aside, let the credentialed people handle it. 20 years of emergency management in Aldridge had just discovered that his judgment had a blind spot shaped exactly like the system he worked for. He evaluated competence by credentials equipment titles. Colter Overby had none of those three things, and Aldridge had almost dismissed the only person on that mountain who understood the problem. That was not admiration. Not yet. It was something more uncomfortable. The quiet shame of a man realizing he had almost made the exact mistake he had always believed only other people made. The sound of a helicopter broke through his thoughts. Aldridge looked up and saw the aircraft coming in low over the tree line from the south, its rotors chopping the air with the particular authority that corporate transport always carries the sound of money arriving to supervise. Lyle Elkins stepped out before the rotors had fully stopped. Mid-50s gray suit, black leather shoes that sank immediately into the dirt of the barnyard. He had the face of a man who made decisions before he arrived at places and considered the arrival itself a formality. He was the vice president of operations for the Portland division, and he had not flown to mile marker 47 to help. He had flown there to control. He walked directly to Aldridge without greeting anyone else and pulled him away from the group. His voice was low, but carried the sharpened edges of him and whose authority has been challenged by someone who does not have the rank to challenge it. I have just been informed that you authorized a civilian, an elderly man with no license, no insurance, and no professional certification to access a $23 million company asset using an unregistered machine. Do you have any idea what the liability exposure is on something like this? Aldridge explained the situation. Fisk's assessment, the 3 to 5 day timeline, the $20,000 per hour that was evaporating while they stood here talking about liability. Elkins did not listen. Not in the way that people do not listen when they are distracted, in the way that people do not listen when they have already decided and consider new information and inconvenience. Shut it down. Get Fisk to give me the unloading plan. I do not care if it takes 5 days. I care about not losing careers, mine or yours. Aldridge felt the weight of the words land exactly where they were aimed. Mine or yours. That was not a warning. It was a blueprint. If this went wrong, Elkins would make sure the blame fell on one person and one person only, and it would not be the vice president of operations. And then Dr. Fisk did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She had been standing near the barn entrance, examining the connection assembly that Colter had begun fabricating on the floor of the barn. 2 lengths of high-tension logging chain, coiled beside a salvaged yoke beam from an old farm implement. 4 heavy shackle links that Ira Overby had contributed from Harmon's supply trailer earlier that day, delivered with words that were cold, but hands that were careful. She had been crouching over the layout for several minutes, pressing her palm against the yoke beam, checking the chain angles running, geometry in her head with the instinctive ease of someone who dreams in load distribution equations. She stood up and walked to where Aldridge and Elkins were standing. She did not address Elkins. She spoke only to Aldridge, and her voice was low enough that Elkins had to lean in to hear, which shifted the power dynamic in a way so subtle that only Aldridge noticed. I have examined the transfer rig that Mr. Overby is building. The load distribution across 3 anchor points on the front chassis frame is actually sound from an engineering standpoint. He is spreading the force instead of concentrating it at a single coupling, which is exactly the opposite of what every attempt today has done. She paused. I am not saying it will work. I am saying it is not irrational. Then she walked away. She did not choose a side. She did not argue for or against Colter. She simply placed a single piece of technical credibility on Aldridge's side of the scale and let gravity do the rest. Aldridge looked at Elkins. The mountain air was cooling. The light was beginning to turn from white to amber. Somewhere inside the barn, the sound of Colter Overby's wrench against iron continued in a rhythm that had not changed or faltered since the moment he started. Lyle, you can fire me after the train moves or after it does not move, but for the next 4 hours, this is my scene. Elkins stared at him for 5 full seconds. Then he stepped back, pulled his phone from his jacket, and walked toward the helicopter. He did not leave. He stood beside it with the phone pressed to his ear, calling the company's legal team, building the case that he would need if this went wrong. A man constructing his alibi in real time. 4 hours turned into 4 hours and 20 minutes. Nobody complained. The technical problem Colter had been solving was not simply starting the engine. That part, as he had predicted, came together with the slow certainty of a process he had performed hundreds of times. The harder problem was the connection. Locomotive 983 used a modern AAR coupling, a design that had not existed when Colter's engine was built. There was no compatible hitch. What Colter fabricated instead was remarkable in its simplicity. The logging chains, the yoke beam, and the shackle links came together into a bridging assembly that distributed pulling force across 3 separate anchor points on the locomotive's front chassis frame. It was not a factory solution. It was the kind of solution that comes from someone who has spent decades understanding how force travels through metal, where it concentrates, where it dissipates, and how to make it go where you need it to go instead of where it wants to go. When the 1908 engine rolled slowly out of the barn on her own iron wheels in the late afternoon light, the small group that had gathered stood watching in near silence. She moved under a low head of steam, her drive wheels turning in slow and deliberate rotations. Black smoke drifted from her stack in a thin column. The ground trembled with each stroke of her pistons, a deep measured pulse that traveled up through the soles of your boots and settled in your chest like a second heartbeat. Colter walked alongside her, one hand on the running board rail, guiding her down the dirt lane toward Route 9 the way a man walks beside an animal he trusts completely. At the staging area, the Harmon crew drifted closer without realizing they were moving. Aldridge stood 10 yards back, his phone in his hand, but forgotten. Elkins watched from beside his helicopter, still on the phone, but his words had stopped, and the phone was just pressed against his ear like a prop he had forgotten to put down. Colter built pressure with the same deliberateness with which he did everything, fed the firebox with measured care, watched the pressure gauge with the attention of a man reading a language he learned before he learned to read English. After 11 minutes, he opened the main throttle. Not quickly, not with drama, with the controlled precision of someone who has done this 10,000 times, still takes it seriously every single time. The chains pulled taut. The yoke beam groaned once. The engine leaned into her load. Nothing moved. Locomotive 983 sat exactly where she had sat all day. Colter held the pressure steady for 90 seconds. Then he eased back, let the engine breathe. He waited a full minute. Then he opened the throttle again, with a different rhythm, a pulsed application building in 2-second intervals, releasing building again. The chains vibrated. The yoke beam hummed under tension. And then so subtly that two people in the group later said they thought they had imagined it. Locomotive 983 shifted. Not even a full inch. A low metallic groan traveled the length of the train from front to rear. The sound of 32 cars moving fractionally against 32 sets of locked wheels. Then it stopped. Ira Overby had been crouching near the front wheel assembly, watching the rail contact point. He stood up slowly and looked at Aldridge with the honest, tired expression of a man delivering news he wished were different. One shift. She has resettled. It is not going to work, Mr. Aldridge. Mangrum's voice came from behind the group, flat and final. That is it. Let the professionals handle this. Colter did not raise his voice. He did not turn around. He kept his eyes on the gauge panel in front of him and spoke the way a man states something that is simply and plainly true. She moved. Nobody responded. You all felt it. Every wheel on that train shifted, every one. He reached forward and made a small adjustment to the pressure valve, his hands moving without urgency. That was the lock breaking. What just happened is not a failure. He glanced back over his shoulder and his gaze moved across the group, not settling on anyone, not seeking agreement or approval, just confirming that he was being heard. That train just woke up. Then he turned back to his gauges and began building pressure again, with the quiet certainty of a man who already knows what comes next, even if no one else on that mountain does. Elkins stepped forward from beside the helicopter, phone in hand, voice tight. Aldridge, enough! Aldridge did not look at Elkins. He kept his eyes on Colter Overby, on the old man's hands moving across the controls of a machine that had been sleeping for 31 years and had just been asked to do the one thing she was built for. The mountain air was cooling fast. The light was going amber at the edges. And somewhere between the last groan of iron and the next breath of the engine, Aldridge made a decision that had nothing to do with his career and everything to do with something he could not have explained to the man in the gray suit standing behind him with a phone full of lawyers. He kept his eyes on Colter, and he said nothing, which in that moment on that mountain was the loudest thing anyone could have said. Nobody spoke. The mountain had gone quiet in the way high places do, just before dark when the wind drops and the birds stop calling, and the whole world seems to be holding something in its chest that it is not ready to release. The only sound was the old engine, her pistons moving in a cadence that had changed since the first attempt, slower now, deeper, each stroke arriving with the measured weight of something that has found its working rhythm and intends to hold it. The chains hung taut between her frame and the nose of Locomotive 983. Two lengths of iron connecting two machines separated by more than a century of engineering. One of them enormous and modern and dead, the other small and ancient and alive with a kind of mechanical patience that nobody watching had ever seen in a machine before. Dr. Hazel Fisk had been standing motionless near the front of the group for the past 2 minutes. When Elkins started to move forward from the helicopter, his mouth already forming the words that would shut everything down, Fisk did something she had not planned and could not have explained if anyone had asked her about it later. She reached out and placed her hand on his forearm. She did not grip. She did not push. She just placed her hand there lightly, and when Elkins turned to look at her, she met his gaze and held it without saying a word. Her face carried the particular kind of certainty that Elkins, for all his authority and all his lawyers and all his corporate infrastructure, did not have the tools to argue with. It was the certainty of someone who understands physics, who understands that something is happening in front of her that she did not predict but can now see the logic of. and who is telling him without words to wait. Elkins stopped, not because he agreed, because certainty when you encounter it in someone who has no reason to fake it is harder to override than you expect. Up on the operator's platform, Colter Overby made his adjustments. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at the locomotive. He looked only at the gauges in front of him, and his hands moved across the controls with the specific, unhurried confidence of a man performing a task he has mastered so thoroughly that his body remembers it independent of his mind, the way a pianist's fingers find the keys in the dark. He opened the cutoff valve slightly wider than he had run it on the first attempt. Then he reduced the throttle by a fraction. The change in the engine's voice was immediate. The sharp, rapid exhaust cadence softened into something longer and lower, a sound that had weight to it, a sound you could feel in the ground before you heard it in the air. Each stroke of the pistons arrived with more deliberation and less urgency, the way a river slows when it deepens, carrying more force in the same current, by spreading it across a wider, steadier channel. The drive wheels, which had been spinning in short bursts on the first attempt, now turned in full measured rotations. Each one pressed down against the rail with controlled, even weight, finding traction not through speed but through sustained contact. The chains tightened. The yoke beams settled into tension without groaning this time. Quietly, the way a rope settles when the knot has finally found its true position and everything above and below it aligns. Colter watched the pressure gauge hold steady. He made one final adjustment, a small reduction to the exhaust injector, and then he held everything exactly where it was and let the machine work. For 7 seconds, nothing happened. 7 seconds is not a long time. Unless you are standing on the side of a mountain in failing light, watching an old man on a machine, older than anyone alive, try to do what 19 modern vehicles and the best equipment in the Pacific Northwest could not do, then 7 seconds is an eternity. Then 7 seconds is long enough to believe it is over. Then Locomotive 983 moved, not a shudder, not a fractional shift like the first attempt. She moved, slowly, with a deep iron groan that began somewhere in her front chassis and rolled the full 300 feet of her length like a wave traveling through a body of water so vast that you can see it coming before you feel it arrive. Her drive wheels broke free from the railhead, one axle at a time, each one releasing with a low metallic crack that sounded nothing like failure and everything like permission. A sequential unlocking that traveled backward through the train, car by car, coupling by coupling, 32 units of resistance giving way one after another in a chain reaction of surrender. She rolled 1 foot, then 2, then 5. The slack worked through the couplings from front to rear, and each car shifted and swayed as the momentum reached it, a long, low wave of motion passing through metal and mass and frozen machinery, waking each car the way morning light moves through a house room by room, window by window, until the whole structure is alive. Nobody moved. Nobody made a sound. Dr. Hazel Fisk had both hands pressed flat against her mouth, not in shock, in recognition. She was watching something that her calculations had told her was improbable, and she was watching it happen anyway, and the engineer in her was already revising everything she thought she knew about the relationship between force and resistance, while the human being in her was simply standing there with her hands over her mouth and her eyes wide witnessing. Ira Overby stood beside the front wheel assembly of Locomotive 983, the exact spot where he had crouched 2 hours earlier, and declared that the train was not coming off the railhead. His arms hung at his sides. His body was completely still. He watched the front wheels turn the wheels he had pronounced dead, and on his face was something more complicated than surprise. There was shock, yes, There was the disorientation of a professional watching his own confident assessment proven wrong in real time. But beneath that, moving through his expression, the way a current moves beneath the surface of still water, there was something else. Something that had nothing to do with trains or wheels or professional pride. He was watching a machine that his father had once stood beside, being operated by a man he had spent his entire adult life distancing himself from accomplish, something that his own generation's tools and training and technology could not. And somewhere in that collision of past and present, something inside Ira Overby that had been locked in position for a very long time was beginning quietly and against his will to shift. Cass Mangrum had straightened up from the fender of his truck where he had been leaning for the past hour. His arms hung loose, his mouth was slightly open. He was staring at the train with the expression of a man who has just watched the rules of his profession rewritten by someone who was never supposed to be in the room. Barrett Aldridge watched the train move and felt something rise in his chest that caught him off guard. Not just relief, though the relief was enormous. A physical weight lifting from his shoulders and his lungs, and the place behind his sternum, where he had been storing every ounce of pressure since 6:14 that morning. Not just the practical satisfaction of a $23 million crisis being resolved, something quieter, something that had nothing to do with cargo or timelines or the promotion he had spent 3 years chasing. It was the feeling of watching patience outlast noise, of watching one man with an old machine do what 19 modern vehicles had failed to accomplish, not by being stronger than them, not by having better equipment or more advanced technology, but by understanding something about the problem that all of them, with all of their credentials and all of their experience, had forgotten to ask about. Colter held the engine at her working pace for 2 full minutes. Locomotive 983 moved steadily forward along the grade, her wheels turning freely. Now the locked assemblies fully released from the embedded rail contact rolling on iron the way they were built to roll, 40 feet from her original position. Then Colter eased the throttle back with the same deliberateness with which he had opened it, brought the engine to a gentle stop, and set the brake. He sat still in the operator's seat for a long moment after the engine went quiet. The mountain air settled around him. The last wisps of steam curled from the valve and dissolved into the evening sky. Then he climbed down from the platform slowly and without ceremony and walked to the front of the engine where the chains connected to the yoke beam and began disconnecting them. Cass Mangrum got there before Aldridge did. He walked across the gravel with a different stride than the one he had arrived with that morning. Slower, quieter, the swagger gone from his shoulders, replaced by something that sat lower and weighed more. He stopped 2 paces from Colter and stood there while the old man worked the first shackle pin, and for a long moment he said nothing. Just watched the way Colter's fingers moved on the iron, precise, practiced, knowing exactly how much force to apply and where. "You want a consulting contract?" Mangrum said finally. His voice sounded nothing like the voice that had told Ira to step aside 12 hours earlier. It was stripped down, simple. The voice of a man who has just learned something and is still adjusting to the weight of it. "Harmon could use somebody who understands machines the way you do." Colter looked up. The 2 men regarded each other across 2 feet of mountain air and several decades of divergent experience. Colter considered the offer the way he considered everything, without rushing, without performing. Then he shook his head, slowly, without judgment. "I do not consult, I do, and today I am done doing." Mangrum nodded, once. Short and heavy, the way a man nods when he accepts something he does not fully understand but knows enough to respect. Then he turned and walked back toward his trucks, and Colter returned to the shackle without watching him go. Aldridge arrived and stood beside Colter while the old man worked the second pin loose with the wrench he kept in his jacket pocket. The crew parted without being asked, opening a path the way people do when they sense that something is happening between two individuals that the rest of them are only meant to witness, not participate in. Mr. Overby, Colter glanced up. Why could nobody else do that? It was an honest question asked quietly. The way a man asks something he genuinely wants to understand, not because the answer will change anything that has already happened, but because it might change something in him that has not happened yet. Colter worked the pin free and set the shackle on the ground with the careful placement of someone who does not drop things. He was quiet for a moment, not reluctant, choosing. They were all thinking about pulling, he said, pulling harder, pulling with more. He moved to the next shackle, but the problem was never the size of the force, it was the nature of it. He paused and his hands stilled on the iron for a moment. You cannot bully iron. You work with it or you do not move it. Aldridge looked at the locomotive, free on the track, wheels clear, ready to move under her own power once the drive systems were repaired. $23 million of cargo, a project back on schedule, a problem that every expert on the mountain had declared impossible, solved in under 2 hours by one man and a machine built before the First World War. You made it look simple, Aldridge said. It is simple, Colter said. One. That is the part people forget. He began coiling the first chain and practiced even loops, his hands finding the rhythm of a motion they had performed thousands of times. Somewhere along the way, everybody stopped learning how these machines actually work. They learned how to operate them, how to read the manuals, how to run the software. He looked up at Aldridge, but they forgot how to listen to them. He finished the first chain and set it down. Then he reached for the second, and as he did, he stopped. Ira Overby was standing 10 feet away. He had not come from the direction of the Harmon trucks or the staging area. He had come from the direction of Route 9, from the direction of the farmhouse, and he was not standing the way he had stood all day, stiff, guarded shoulders drawn up around his ears like armor. He was standing differently. Something in his posture had come undone. He looked like a man who had been running a very long time and had finally stopped, not because he reached where he was going, but because he realized he had been running in the wrong direction. I went to the house, Ira said. His voice was raw in a way that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Grandma showed me. He held up a photograph, small rectangular with white borders that had yellowed. Aldridge recognized it immediately. The photograph from the kitchen wall. Pen Overby, 1972. A young man barely 17 smiling beside the engine with his hand on the boiler. Colter saw the photograph and his hands stopped on the chain. Not for 2 seconds this time. They stopped completely. The wrench in his right hand lowered to his side, in his left hand the hand that had been steady on valve handles and throttle levers and gauge controls all day without a single tremor. That hand came to rest on the edge of the engine's running board, and Aldridge saw unmistakably that it was shaking. Colter looked at the photograph for a long time, longer than he had looked at any gauge or any pressure reading or any piece of machinery all day. Longer than he had looked at the locomotive when she first moved. He looked at it the way you look at something you have been avoiding for so many years, that seeing it again feels like stepping into a room you had convinced yourself no longer existed. And then Colter looked up at Ira. Your father understood her. His voice was not entirely steady. For the first time all day, for the first time since he had walked out of the tree line and spoken to Aldridge, and endured Mangram's laughter, and Elkins's threats, and the collective doubt of every professional on the mountain, the voice that had never needed to rise because it had never needed to prove anything was carrying something it could not fully hold. Her did not mean Locomotive 983. Both of them knew what he meant. "I know," Ira said. "Two words." And Aldrich, standing close enough to see both their faces, understood that those two words were what Colter Overby had been waiting for. Not for 31 years, the length of time the engine had been under his canvas. Not for 52 years, the distance back to the day in 1974, when the company had told him no and his son had paid for it. Longer than that, Colter had been waiting for those two words since the day Penn died, and took with him the only person in the family who had understood why the old machines mattered, and left behind a grandson who grew up believing that understanding was a kind of weakness and embarrassment, a thing to be outgrown. "I know." Colter nodded, slowly, and he reached one hand down from the platform. Ira took it. He climbed up onto the running board, and the two of them stood together on the engine, grandfather and grandson, and neither of them said anything more, because there was nothing more that needed to be said in words. There are moments in a man's life when the distance between two people closes, not because someone crosses it, but because both of them stop walking away at the same time. This was one of those moments. 20 yards back, Lyle Elkins stood beside his helicopter with his phone in his hand. The screen was dark. He had stopped calling. He had stopped talking. He looked at the scene in front of him, the old man, the young man, the ancient engine, the freed locomotive, the crew standing silent on the gravel, and on his face was an expression that Aldrich would later describe to his wife as the look of a man who has just realized that nothing in his toolbox applies to what he is seeing. Elkins turned. He walked to the helicopter. He climbed in without a word to anyone. The rotor spun up and the aircraft lifted off the ground and banked south toward Portland, carrying a man who would never mention Colter Overby's name in any report or any meeting or any conversation for the rest of his career. In the official record of the incident at mile marker 47, the train would be noted as having been freed through the application of specialized recovery techniques by the on-site team. No further details, no names, no 1908 steam engine. And Aldrich, watching the helicopter shrink against the darkening sky, made his peace with that. Some things that happen do not need to be in the record to be real. The people who were there would know, and that he decided was enough. Colter coiled the second chain, loaded the yoke beam onto the running board, climbed back into the operator's seat with Ira standing beside him on the platform, one hand on the rail, the way his father had once stood in a photograph that was now tucked into his back pocket instead of hanging on a kitchen wall. The 1908 engine came back to life with a low, familiar exhale patient and unhurried, the same steady voice she had carried for 116 years. Colter guided her slowly back up Route 9 toward the dirt lane and the barn and the farmhouse, where Willa Overby was standing on the porch with the kitchen light behind her waiting. He did not look back. Nobody called after him. Nobody tried to stop him or offer him anything or ask him to stay. They just stood at the edge of the mountain road and watched him go. 19 people with 19 vehicles and every credential the industry could offer, standing in the last light of a Tuesday that none of them would ever be able to fully explain to anyone who had not been there. The sound of the engine faded slowly into the trees. First, the exhaust note disappeared, swallowed by the Douglas fir and the mountain air. Then the low vibration in the ground faded, the last physical trace of her passing absorbed into the rock and the soil. And then there was nothing but the wind and the evening and the train sitting free on the tracks, behind them silent and ready to move. Barrett Aldrich stood there for a long time after the sound was gone. He stood there thinking about what Colter Overby had said. Not just the words, but the life behind them. About what it means to truly understand a thing versus simply knowing how to use it. About patience as a form of skill and not a failure of ambition. about how much knowledge is lost when the old ways of understanding are set aside not because they stopped working, not because they were proven wrong, not because something better replaced them, but simply because they stopped being fashionable, because they stopped being taught, because the men and women who carried that knowledge got old and quiet and stepped back from the tree line and let the younger, louder, faster world move on without them. He thought about Coulter's hands on the engine, the way they knew every valve and every lever and every gauge, not from reading a manual, but from decades of standing in the heat and the noise and the vibration and learning slowly through repetition and attention and the kind of patience that most people no longer have the time for, how to listen to a machine the way you listen to a person. Not for what it is saying on the surface, but for what it is telling you underneath. He thought about Pen Overby dead at 22, and about the photograph on the kitchen wall, and about the fact that Colter had kept the engine under its canvas for 31 years, not out of stubbornness or sentimentality, but out of something closer to grief. She was the last thing his son had touched with understanding. The last place where what Colter knew and what Penn loved had existed in the same space. Covering her was not storage, it was burial. And uncovering her today was not maintenance, it was resurrection. And he thought about Ira climbing onto that running board, about what it costs a man to spend years running from something and then in a single afternoon stop running. Not because someone convinced him to stop, but because he finally saw with his own eyes what he had been running from. And it was not embarrassment. It was not backwardness. It was his own inheritance. The best part of where he came from, waiting quietly in a barn at the end of a dirt road for someone in the family to come back and claim it. Behind Aldridge Locomotive 983 sat free on the track, ready to move. The crisis was over. The cargo would reach Portland. The project would resume. His career would survive, probably. The promotion might come, or it might not. It mattered less than it had 12 hours ago. Because something else had happened at mile marker 47 on the old Rocky Pass line that Tuesday. Something that had nothing to do with trains or towing or deadlines or quarterly performance reviews. Something quieter and more lasting than any of that. Every person who had been standing on that mountain when the train moved knew it. The ones who would talk about it for years and the ones who would never mention it again. The ones who would understand what they had witnessed and the ones who would spend the rest of their lives trying to. They all knew that something had shifted that evening that went beyond iron wheels breaking free from embedded rails. They had watched a man be proven right after a lifetime of being set aside. They had watched the old ways reach across half a century and do what the new ways could not. They had watched a grandfather and a grandson find each other on the running board of a machine that should have been in a museum, but was instead on that particular Tuesday in that particular mountain pass, the most capable piece of equipment within 100 miles. And they had watched that man, when the work was done, coil his chains and climb back up and drive home without asking for anything, without waiting for applause or recognition or a check or a contract or even a thank you. He simply finished the job and left the way a man does when the work was never about him to begin with, when it was always about something larger and older and more important than any single person's need to be seen. The kitchen light was on at the farmhouse when the engine rolled up the dirt lane for the last time. Willa was on the porch. She did not wave. She did not call out. She just stood there with her arms crossed against the evening chill and watched her husband bring the engine home with their grandson standing beside him. And the look on her face was not surprise and not triumph and not relief. It was the look of a woman who has known something for a very long time and has finally been given permission to stop carrying it alone. Colter brought the engine into the barn. Ira helped him secure the brake and close the firebox damper and drain the remaining steam pressure through the relief valve. They worked together without speaking, and their hands moved in the same rhythm. And if you had been standing in the doorway watching their silhouettes against the lamplight inside the barn, you would not have been able to tell from the way they moved which one was the old man and which was the young one. You would only have seen two people who understood the same machine working together the way people work when they have finally stopped pretending they do not need each other. When they were finished, Colter pulled the canvas tarp back over the engine. He did it slowly, the same way he had uncovered her that afternoon, with care, with respect. But something was different this time. He was not burying her again. He was putting her to bed. And there is a world of difference between the two. One is an ending. The other is a pause, a rest between one day's work and the next. Ira stood beside him as the last fold of canvas settled over the boiler. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out the photograph. He looked at it for a moment, at his father's face, at the young man's hand resting on the machine that was now hidden beneath the tarp, at the smile that belonged to a world before the worst thing happened. Then he held it out to Colter. Colter took the photograph. He held it in both hands. He looked at it for a long time, and in the lamplight of the barn, standing next to the covered engine with the mountain dark outside and the first stars beginning to show above the tree line, his face held an expression that was beyond anything Aldridge or Fisk or Mangrum or anyone else on that mountain would have recognized, because it was not meant for them. It was meant for the young man in the picture who had understood the engine, who had loved the work, who had been broken by a decision made by men who did not listen, and who had been gone for nearly 50 years. Colter slid the photograph into the inside pocket of his canvas jacket over his heart. He looked at Ira. "Come on Sunday," he said. "I will show you how she runs." Ira nodded, and the nod contained everything that the afternoon had broken open and everything that the evening had quietly begun to repair. They walked out of the barn together. Colter pulled the wooden doors closed and latched them. Willa was waiting on the porch with 2 cups of coffee, and the three of them stood there in the dark for a while, not talking, just standing together the way families do when they have found their way back to each other and do not yet trust themselves to speak about it for fear that words will make it smaller than it is. Somewhere down the mountain on the old Rocky Pass line at mile marker 47, Locomotive 983 sat free on the rails waiting for a repair crew that would arrive at first light. The cargo would reach Portland 2 days late, but intact. The construction project would resume. The insurance claims would be filed, and the reports would be written, and the meetings would be held, and in none of them would the name Colter Overby appear. But every person who stood on that mountain on that Tuesday knew something that no report could capture and no meeting could contain. They knew that they had witnessed something rare, not a feat of engineering, not a triumph of technology, something older than both. The quiet, patient, irreplaceable power of a man who had spent his whole life learning how to listen to things that most people had stopped hearing a long time ago. Some knowledge does not shout, it waits. Quiet and patient in a barn at the end of a dirt road under a canvas tarp in the hands of a man the world forgot to ask. It waits for the day the world finally runs out of louder answers. And when that day comes, it does not say, "I told you so." It simply rolls out of the barn, leans into the load, and does what it was always built to do.